Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Gramercy Books Author Night, featuring award-winning journalist Kathryn Miles and her just-released book, Trailed by Algonquin, the riveting deep dive into the unsolved murders of two free-spirited young women in the Shenandoah wilderness. Kate will be in conversation with crime writer and journalist Andrew Welsh-Huggins. I'm Linda Cass. We're live streaming this program through Zoom webinar, and it will be recorded. Let me preview the next hour or so for you. After introductions, Kate and Andrew will talk for about 35 minutes. That will be followed by 15 to 20 minutes for your questions, submitted in the Q&A box, typically located at the bottom of your screen if you're using a desk or laptop. This is where Andrew will be taking your questions for Kate during that latter portion of the program. You can write your questions, however, into this box at any time, and those questions liked by others will be upvoted, which means they'll rise to the top of the box and more likely to be asked. Another tool is the chat box, and this allows you to chat among yourselves, but it will not be monitored by the panelists. If you click on the chat box icon now, it will open a column on the right side of your screen with links to 4 upcoming author programs at Gramercy Books. Just to note, for in-person programs, we require proof of vaccination and encourage attendees to wear masks to ensure everyone's safety. All our programs begin at 7 p.m. On Monday, May 23rd, we are excited to host B.A. Shapiro, New York Times bestselling author of The Art Forger, who has a new novel of psychological suspense, Metropolis. She will be in conversation with former Dispatch arts editor Nancy Gilson in person at Gramercy Books. Also in person at the bookstore on Friday, June 3rd, we will welcome sports writer Dave Lewis and feature his new book, Michael Jordan, Life Lessons from His Airness, Secrets to Success from the Greatest Basketball Player of All Time. We return to a virtual conversation on Thursday, June 9th, when we feature Jean Hanff Corlitz, New York Times bestselling author of The Plot, whose new immersive novel is The Latecomer. Jean will be in conversation with novelist and journalist Anna Quindlen. And the last program I'll offer here will be Monday, June 13th, also a virtual conversation and featuring acclaimed writer Marie Mayung-Ok Lee and her novel, The Evening Hero, a sweeping story that follows a Korean immigrant pursuing the American dream. Marie will be in conversation with master storyteller Gish Jen. Click on any link to any of the links you have there to learn more about the program as well as to register. You can learn about all of Gramercy Books author programs on our website. We list them all the way through July right now and through our e-newsletter. Sign up for our newsletter at gramercybooksbexley.com. Now let's meet tonight's guests. In May of 1996, Julie Williams and Lolly Winans were brutally murdered while backpacking in Virginia's Shenandoah National Park, adjacent to the world-famous Appalachian Trail. Kate Miles was a professor at a wilderness college in Maine when the 2002 indictment against a man already in prison was announced. Her enormous interest in this case only grew over time, and some 20 years after the murders, she began to seek answers. Her investigation is detailed in Trailed, One Woman's Quest to Solve the Shenandoah Murders. Kate Miles is the author of 5 books. Her essays and articles have appeared in publications such as Audubon, Best American Essays, Best American Short Sports Writing, the Boston Globe, the New York Times, Politico, and Time. A contributing editor at Down East magazine, Kate also serves as a scholar in residence for the Maine Humanities Council and as a faculty member in several MFA programs. Kate, it's a thrill to welcome you to Gramercy Books and to share your true crime investigation with our Central Ohio community.
Hi, it's great to virtually be there. I grew up in the Midwest, and so I feel almost like I'm home. I feel like I should bring you all a casserole or something.
We'd love that. Anyway, in conversation with Kate is Andrew Welsh-Huggins. Andrew is a reporter for the Associated Press in Columbus, Ohio, and the Nero Award finalist, author of 7 Mysteries from Swallow Press, featuring Andy Hayes, a former Ohio State and Cleveland Browns quarterback turned private eye. Andrew is also the editor of Columbus Noir, and his short fiction has appeared in publications including Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine, Mystery Weekly, and Mystery Tribune. His standalone suspense thriller, The End of the Road, arrives from Mysterious Press in the summer of 2023. And note that his nonfiction book, No Winners Here Tonight, is the definitive history of the death penalty in Ohio. Andrew, welcome back to Gramercy Books, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Great to be here, Linda. Thanks so much.
Now, a warm welcome to Kathryn Miles in conversation with Andrew Welsh-Huggins.
Hello, everyone. And Kate, so glad to have you here. So looking forward to talking about this book. Just as a reminder to repeat what Linda said, at any time you can post your questions in the Q&A section, and we'll get to those after we finish our conversation. I did just want to note a couple of things that probably don't need to say too much about this for this crowd, but this is it's an amazing book. It does touch on some fairly dark subject matter, so you should probably be a little prepared for that. And I should note that in our conversation, it's inevitable we're probably going to touch on some spoilers. We'll try to not do that too badly, but don't let that stop you from reading the book. Let me just start quickly by saying, this is really a book that I enjoyed so much for a couple of reasons. The subject matter is so compelling, but then combining with your first person voice, which comes out so clearly, and it really helps invest us in the story, and it really gave me a window into the mechanics of not just how you investigated this particular crime, but just of reporting and writing in general. So it's just an amazing job. I thought I might start by just asking you about, obviously, the two most important people in this book are Julie and Lolly. And I was wondering if you could just start by introducing us to them and, tell us what made them so special.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for starting with that. When I sat down to write this, it was really important to me that they remain foregrounded in the book as a whole. And so I really appreciate that they're being foregrounded here too. Julie Williams grew up in Minnesota in a very kind of small, close-knit Catholic community. She was known for being quiet, studious, but also a lot of fun to be around. And, her friends, by the time she got to high school, her friends were referring to her as a one-woman Peace Corps. She was fluent in Spanish by the time she was in high school and was translating for domestic abuse survivors who were trying to give testimony and get protection. She went to college at Carleton College, also in Minnesota, studied geology. And while she was there, really got involved in some really interesting archaeological projects in Europe. She also continued to do missionary work in Central and South America. And she spent several of her summers working both on tribal lands, doing geologic work, and then also as an intern in national parks. So, well-traveled, very confident and competent, in all sorts of different situations. In May of 1995, she arrived at a really wonderful outdoor program called Woods Women, which was founded in the 1980s as a kind of corrective to the kind of hierarchical based models of programs like Outward Bound and Knowles or the National Outdoor Leadership School. She went and took a canoeing class there, and she just fell so in love with the program that she decided she was going to return later that month, actually, to take a leadership course so that she could become a trip leader at this program. That same month, Lolly Winans arrived. Lolly, who in a lot of ways was yin to Julie's yang. Lolly had grown up in a very, very affluent family in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. The family splintered somewhat when she revealed that she was an incest survivor. And so that kind of, put a big wedge between her and her parents. She sort of floated around a little bit, trying to find her footing. And she eventually found her way to Unity College, where she had really found a sense of purpose in the idea that she was going to study adventure therapy and outdoor recreation so that she could lead other sexual assault survivors on wilderness trips as well. She was always the life of the party. Everybody just gravitated towards her. She was very, very funny. She never minced words. She followed the Grateful Dead. She followed Fish. She loved to have, parties with guitars and some Coronas. And she arrived larger than life on the scene at Woods Women, again, May of ~95. And by all accounts, it was love at first sight. And the two just completely hit it off. And in this very sort of safe, kind of nurturing community, the two really had an opportunity to explore a relationship in a way that in most places in 1995 they wouldn't have been. As I write in the prologue to the book, the concept of coming out or being outwardly queer in 1995 was definitely a bridge too far for the overwhelming majority of Americans. So in this space, they had this sort of rare and wonderful opportunity to really explore their relationship. And then at the end of the summer, Lolly returned to Unity College, Julie moved to Vermont, and they had a somewhat rocky school year trying to negotiate this long distance relationship. But by May of '96, had really committed to the relationship and to doing whatever it took to make it work.
I want you to talk just briefly about something you touched on, which was the Woods Women and the way that was a counterbalance to, I think you used the word hierarchical, but let's face it, I think sexist is another way to look at the way women trying to appreciate the outdoors were experiencing. And you write in there, I think you or someone counted up advertisements in outdoors magazines, and in almost all the cases, they pictured men doing stuff and women around a campfire, like holding a coffee cup or something. Can you talk a little bit about what it meant for them to be part of this movement at the time, to really take the space of nature back, or say, hey, we're here too. We want to do this too, and we're not going to hold your coffee cup.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's really, it's over 200 years of history, as I sort of point out in a little set piece in one of the chapters in the book. Is if you really go back to, for instance, the British Romantics and their approach to walking, and then here in the United States, we have people like Thoreau and Emerson, sort of John Muir, offering one version of how to be in the wilderness. And then very interestingly, immediately after World War II, members of the Army's 10th Mountain Division came back. And these were folks who had backcountry skills and skiing skills and became these like elite fighters that kind of fought in the Alps in Italy. They came back highly skilled with the best gear that had ever existed in terms of outdoor recreation, and kind of looked around for a home for themselves after World War II. And they were really the sort of defining voice of outdoor recreation for decades after World War II. And they took a model that was based on both the British Navy and the American Army, which is, if you take a person in the wilderness and you offer increasing stress, they'll have to kind of find their way. So you start maybe on day one with a trust fall. And then the next day you do maybe a blindfolded walk. And then on the third day, you have the person rappel off of a mountain. And if you keep increasing the stress, the person's going to have to kind of reckon with whatever it was that brought them there. But what I think this really overlooked was the fact that for many people, just the act of being in the wilderness comes with some stress. And so that was a very sort of exclusionary model. It was also a model, as you said, that's really had to have several decades now of correction, where there's been whistleblowers calling attention to sexual harassment, misogyny, from just the names of, for instance, the rapids in the mountains they were climbing, to the way that women were being treated in the organization. So Woods Women, which was founded in the 1980s by a group of women who were also outdoor leaders, said, well, look, there's another way, right? We don't have to take this military model. We can have consensus building, we can have community building, and we can create a place where you don't have to be stressed. You can just feel good about yourself in the wilderness. That statistic you mentioned, 91% of the people in ads being sort of fit white men, that's from just a very recent scholarly publication. So even today, if you open these glossy magazines, the overwhelming majority of the people featured there are, again, very fit, fairly young white men. And so I think people who don't fit into that category continue to see challenges in terms of trying to find examples and representations of themselves in the outdoors.
So well said. And I just want to say this is one more thing I really appreciate about the book, and I really commend it to people, is you provide not just the story of a crime and the quest for justice, but this wonderful context and background on this issue we just discussed, which honestly, I'm embarrassed to say I was not fully aware of. So just one more really interesting point. Now, if you would, can you move us forward a little bit in time, and however you'd like to, could you talk about the crime that is central to the book?
Sure. So as I had said, after sort of a rocky school year, Lolly and Julie had recommitted to their relationship. They had decided to move in together for the summer, and they both had really busy summers ahead. Julie was going to be doing water quality work on Lake Champlain. Lolly was going to be a counselor at a camp. And so as soon as Lolly wrapped up the semester, they were like, well, let's just go find a place where we can kind of take it easy. Here in New England, you know, this time of year, it's the weather is highly suspect. We had a frost warning last night. We have another one tonight. And so I think they were looking for a place where they weren't going to need mittens, and where they could really just sort of spend some time kind of getting to know each other in person again. And so they settled on Shenandoah National Park, and they decided that they were going to do what was going to be about a 10-day backpacking trip. Happily for us, in terms of looking to recreate that trip, they both kept journals during that time and photographs. They also, in keeping with National Park Service policy, had to file a series of backcountry permits. So in relative detail, we can recreate this trip and how they spent their time. And what we know is that they were definitely taking it easy. They had brought Lolly's dog, Taj, a golden retriever mix, along with them. And while both of them were utterly capable of covering a good 20 miles, you know, on the trail every day, they were doing more like 3 to 5, you know, stopping for picnics, lots of pictures at waterfalls and things like that. And as the trip went on and began to wrap up, they made a decision that is still so curious to me, and I really just can't get my head around. They made a decision to go down a very little known trail called the Bridal Trail, which is not far from a very popular resort called Skyland Lodge, but is a trail that at that point didn't even appear on a good number of maps for the park. About a decade earlier, it had been a very popular trail for trail rides, you know, horseback rides for families. But because the trail started on the other side of the only major road that goes through Shenandoah, the stable managers had decided it wasn't a great idea to have novice horseback riders crossing this fairly busy road. So they relocated the trail riding trail. And this trail fell into real disuse. You know, to this day, it's really hard to find. There's no sign for it. It's overgrown. You know, I've been there countless times, and I still have to kind of walk up and down Skyland a little bit to figure out exactly where it is. But for whatever reason, they chose this trail. They walked down about a third of a mile. And like good backcountry campers, they knew that, you know, the both ethical in terms of environmental use and also safe thing to do is then to bushwhack well off trail and establish a low impact campsite, which is to say, this is not a campsite with a fire ring and a picnic table and a tent platform, right? They just picked a spot, a very hidden spot next to a stream, and they set up their tent. What I also think is really interesting is that if you are to descend the trail from Skyland Lodge, you would walk right past that campsite. And in fact, rangers days later searching for the women won't see the tent for days. So it was hidden. So how it is that a very sophisticated killer and possible serial killer came upon them there remains unknown. I speculate in the book that I think he must have followed them, perhaps from Skyland Lodge. Whatever the case, this individual came with what investigators call a murder kit. So he had at least duct tape, a knife, we believe a gun, we believe possibly another sort of weapon. He managed to subdue both women, bound and gagged them, separated them. We know that he sexually assaulted at least one of them, and then very brutally murdered both of them, and then escaped seemingly without a trace. And because this was a backcountry crime, it took quite a while. We can debate the time of death, which becomes really important later on in terms of the investigation. But if you take it at what the medical examiner suggested, the women were dead at the campsite for probably at least 3 or 4 days before they were found. And so that's also going to complicate the investigation later on.
Just a reminder, feel free to put any questions you have in the Q&A portion, not the chat, but the Q&A. And Kate, if you would just position the resort and Shenandoah where this happened geographically. This is this mid-Virginia? Do I have that right? Or
yeah, mid to maybe a little bit west. It's the Shenandoah mountain range, which runs kind of like a spine diagonally through Virginia. I describe the park itself as sort of like a lizard. It's kind of this long, thin park that runs along the spine. And that one drive, Skyland Drive, is sort of the backbone of the park. And then off to either side, you have these, fairly significant drop-offs of the mountains. And things get very rural and very remote very quickly in the park. And that's one of the kind of ironies of this park, is that it's a really easy drive from Washington, D.C. So it's a very popular park in the nation. But it also, once you get off Skyland, feels like you might as well be, in Utah or the wilds of somewhere out west.
Now, we talked obviously about sort of reclaiming that wilderness adventure for everyone. I want to ask you about your first encounter with this story, because that also revealed something else to you that a lot of people probably don't know. You first, if I have this right, you first encountered the story of their murders after you took a hike on the Appalachian Trail near Tuscarora State Forest in 1998. And while you were on that trip, you learned a disturbing fact about another crime that sounds like it sort of changed your life and connects directly to this story. Can you talk a little bit about that experience and what you learned?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I was a contemporary of Lolly and Julie's. If Julie were still alive, she and I would be the same age, or she might be 1 year older. But right when they were finding backpacking as a very sort of like redemptive, empowering thing to do was right when I was finding it as well too. And for me, really, backpacking was therapeutic in a way that I didn't even know I needed therapy. And it was really the one single thing that really sort of led me to feel kind of empowered and strong, and like I had a real sense of agency. And so by the time I graduated from college in 1996, presumably the same weekend that they were murdered, it was, by far and away, like just about a vocation for me. And so later that summer, I relocated to Delaware to go to graduate school. And so I was literally in the shadow of the Appalachian Trail and would spend quite a lot of time doing what hikers call section hikes, which would be like a 3 to 7 day hike on the trail. And it really was where I felt the strongest and the safest and the freest. And so I would go out of my way to find opportunities to be on the trail. And there was just something so wonderful about putting 40 pounds of my most essential gear on my back and being able to, kind of walk like a turtle and go wherever I needed to do and be just self-sufficient. So it was on one of those trips in November of 98 that I had stopped at one of the original shelters on the Appalachian Trail called Thelma Marks, which is just above a Pennsylvania town called Duncannon. And I had stopped for what I thought was the night. And I was very sort of sanctimonious and upset to see that the Appalachian Trail Conservancy was replacing this original shelter with a brand new one. And, I got all high and mighty and was talking to the trail crew. And I was like, what a shame that you're tearing down history. And they said to me, well, we have to. And I said, well, why is that? And they said, well, because of the murders. And I was dumbstruck. And so went on to learn that a young couple, Molly LaRue and Jeff Hood, had been very brutally murdered and assaulted in this same shelter. And that the shelter had since taken on such a sort of notorious reputation that the ATC had decided to tear it down and build a new one with a new name. at that night, I made the decision that I could not possibly sleep where something so awful had happened. And so I hiked about a half mile or so down the trail, set up my tent, had the worst night of my life, I think, sure that every single thing I heard around me was some kind of intruder. And then I went back to Delaware and started doing some research. And I learned that Molly and Jeff were, at that point, one of about 10 people who had been murdered on the trail. And that there were other couples like Julie and Lolly, like another lesbian couple, Claudia Brenner and Rebecca White, who had also been murdered backpacking just off the trail. And news of that was so utterly astounding to me that it really shattered sort of my sense of peace and security backpacking and in the wilderness.
Now, that introduced you to Julie and Lolly and what happened. You later at Unity College discovered you had a more direct connection with her. How was she remembered there, and what was that like?
So I took my PhD in the spring of 2001, and then by utter coincidence took a teaching job at Unity College, which is where Lolly had been a student when she was murdered. And, you know, by then 5 years had passed since the crime, but this is a tiny, crunchy little college in central Maine. When I was there, it had about 500 undergraduate students, and it was the kind of place where the alumni tended not to go too far. So we were all part of the same community, and it was abundantly obvious to me the minute I arrived there just how impactful Lolly had been in that community. And so now all of a sudden, you know, her professors are my colleagues, her friends have become my friends, and she was just everywhere on that campus. There's a large stone fireplace in the Welcome Center that's dedicated to her. There's an outdoor leadership award that's given every year in her name. And just photos and posters of her leading trips or dancing at the tavern at the sort of end of year dance that we would all go to together. And so she was very much a presence on that campus, even though I had never met her. And so I was just all too aware of who she was and how she had died. And then just a few months later, so again, the start of the semester, September 2001, the second day of classes was September 11th, 2001. And then you flash forward 5 months, you have this tiny little campus rocked, as I think the entire nation was, by the terrorist attacks. And then Attorney General John Ashcroft has this nationally televised press conference in which he announces there's been an indictment in this crime, that the person indicted is known to hate gays and lesbians, and that John Ashcroft and the Justice Department will be using brand new hate crime legislation to seek the death penalty in this case. And in that moment, this became the first federal hate crime in the United States, so noteworthy in that regard. But then what was even more noteworthy for its sort of peculiarness was that he made this very lengthy speech in which he tried to draw comparisons between the grieving country after September 11th and the grieving friends and family of Lolly and Julie, and that somehow by putting this man, Daryl David Rice, to death for that crime, we as a country could somehow heal from September 11th. And so that press conference brought all of the national media attention right back to the college. There were something like over 1,000 articles, you know, in newspapers, magazines around the country. It was once again the top story on the national news. And so I watched again as this campus relived the murder, now with this extra sort of layer of a perceived connection between the murder and September 11th.
And as you write so cogently, given all those articles, all the reporters that descended on campus, no one asked the key question, did they have the right person? Tell us about Daryl Rice and who he is and how he ended up being indicted for this crime.
Daryl Rice was a young man who grew up in and around Virginia and Maryland, and in 1997 was working as a computer programmer near Baltimore. He had suffered his entire life from significant mental illness, what we think is bipolar schizophrenia. He had throughout his life kind of been on and off medication and to varying degrees managed it. But by the spring of 1997, his entire life had begun to come unraveled. He was about to and then soon lost his job. He wasn't taking medication. He was just completely sort of in shambles. And so his father lived right outside of Shenandoah National Park, and Rice was an avid cyclist. He would spend a lot of his weekends and off time cycling through Shenandoah. Early in July of 1997, Rice has been fired from his job. He's in the depths of his mental illness and sort of the worst manifestations of them. He had been up for several days without sleeping and, by his own account, smoking a lot of marijuana, when he decided he was going to drive through the park. And while he was driving along this main road, Skyline, he spies a young woman who is cycling alone. And he sort of gets her in his sights, and he drives back and forth several times. He yells obscenities and expletives at her. He throws a soda bottle at her. He forces her off the road and makes some menacing gestures. And he says, "I'm going to get you." And at that point, she runs away. She gets to a store and eventually gets in touch with the Rangers. And as soon as they hear this report, they think to themselves, "We've got our guy." They eventually apprehend him, and he confesses to harassing and assaulting her. And then he says, "Did you ever solve that murder that happened last summer?" And so at that point, the Rangers are like, "This has got to be the guy." And so they arrested and detained him for this assault against the cyclist, and kind of used that as the space and the opportunity to begin building a case against him.
So they had their culprit in 2002. Walk us forward to your decision to take a deep dive look into this, and what was it that made you think this was worth pursuing?
So in 2002, like, I think a lot of people who were following this case, I thought, great. I mean, not great that Lolly and Julie are murdered, obviously, but thank goodness, finally, after all this time, justice has been served. And there's going to be a conviction. The case is going to be closed, and people are going to begin to feel safe again in the wilderness. And I didn't ask, I wonder if that's the guy. I thought, well, of course that's the guy. And then I think we all just kind of went on our way. And like a lot of people I've met since then, I think I assumed he was probably convicted and put in prison, and that was the end of it. But then in 2016, at that point, I was working as the trail correspondent for Outside magazine, covering long and scenic trails. And the FBI made a very public push for information, leading to the successful conviction of someone in the 96 homicide. And I thought, wait a minute, I thought we already did that, And so I had pitched it as an article to my editor at Outside, and spoke with the FBI. And what the FBI made very clear to me, and what in other interviews that they gave, was that no one had been exonerated and no one had been cleared in this case. And the understory seemed very clearly to be, we still really think it's Rice. We just don't have enough evidence to get a conviction yet. And that's what we need. And I went into the article, sort of taking that at face value and assuming that that was the story I was going to be writing. The FBI had made it seem as if they had new emerging DNA technology that was going to allow them to close the case on Rice. And I thought that's what my story was going to be, was looking at these new developments in forensic testing. But as I started digging into it as a feature story, and I started to realize just how thin the case was against Rice, just tissue paper thin, then it occurred to me that there was a much bigger story happening here.
Just a reminder, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them there in the Q&A section. Now, all this time, Rice is in prison for assaulting the woman that he came across on the road, right? The cyclist.
He served, I think, about 10 years. That's not exactly right, but he served about 10 years for that. So then he was subsequently released from prison after that.
And he's got this shadow hanging over him, but he was never indicted for Julie and Lolly. Is that? No,
he was indicted. And in fact, the case had gotten as far as jury selection, which for me was initially good news, because that meant that all of the evidence that had been exchanged between the prosecution and the defense was available to me by way of discovery, in a way that most open cases, I think journalists don't get access to some of that. But what I think is also really noteworthy here is that when in 2004, the prosecution kept finding again and again and again that the DNA evidence was ruling Rice out as a suspect, they went to the judge and asked the judge to dismiss the case using a legal term called without prejudice. And basically what that means is, we feel really confident that this is the right person, but because of a procedural snafu, we're not confident we can get a conviction. So we're going to suspend our case, but we reserve the right to bring the case back as soon as we have more evidence. So, you know, whether Rice is innocent or guilty, and I'll ultimately leave that up to readers, he lives in this state of double jeopardy right now, where at any point he can be brought back to trial. And his defense team is also sort of very acutely aware that they have an active prosecution against their client that could just kind of speed up at any moment.
Now, you started working on this in 2017 for Outside. Can you talk about the challenges of investigating what at that point was a 21-year-old homicide? And one thing I was really struck by was that, if I have this right, you first visited the campsite where they were killed in February of 2017. Obviously, it's already a very remote area. So what was it like for you going back, you know, looking back, researching so far back in time, a crime of this magnitude?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know, I had maybe hoped a little that the amount of time that had passed would make it less sort of emotionally impactful for me, but that was just not the case. And I had reported fairly extensively on a woman who had gone missing on the trail, and remained missing for several years until her body was found. And I had seen firsthand just how big of an impact that had on me as a reporter. And I would love to talk to you about, you know, your death penalty reporting and how you dealt with that as well too, because I think it's something that we don't really talk about enough. Is just that kind of collateral emotional impact and damage that happens when you cover a story so intensely. And so I was very trepidatious going into this, because I knew that for it to really become a deep dive, I was going to have to look at stuff and read stuff that was just going to leave a really big scar, you know, and it did. So that was still as immediate as if the crimes had just happened a week earlier, but it was challenging to see what people remembered over time, and then to access documents. And, you know, because this was 1996, you know, we're dealing with teletypes, you know, and we're dealing with, you know, 35mm film. And so, you know, getting access to evidence was a very different sort of physical process, in a way that, you know, I mean, PDFs didn't exist then, and email didn't barely existed then. So it was definitely sort of an archival process in some ways too.
So you have the challenge of recreating the crime and going over those aspects with the challenges you just mentioned. But I think one of the things that makes this book stand out is the portrait you paint of Julie and Lolly, and that's clearly from some just in-depth conversations with friends and family. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, both in terms of who you spoke with, but what were the challenges of, you know, coming into these people's lives 2 decades after this had happened, and trying to get them to, you know, paint these portraits of two such special people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know, as an undergraduate, I started off as a journalism major, and I quickly decided that I didn't have the stomach for approaching someone on the worst day of their lives and asking them how it felt to experience the worst day of their lives. And so I ended up majoring in philosophy. But lo and behold, I have found myself in a position where I am repeatedly asking people to relive for me the worst day of their lives. And I think that that builds by necessity a lot of empathy. You know, you cannot be a disinterested observer who just walks in and rattles off questions to people. You really have to build a relationship, and you really have to build trust. And I've learned that in a lot of different ways since my third book, which detailed Superstorm Sandy and some of the tragedies that happened to that too. And I learned really quickly how important it is to give sources the opportunity to get to know you and trust you before they're going to trust you with the stories, especially of their lost loved ones. So I knew that was going to be a part of this. And so one of the first things I did when it became a book is I wrote a letter to Julie's family, just a paper letter, and sort of told them as much as I could about myself and kind of what I wanted to do and why. And then, very happily, her dad called me back right away, and we had a series of phone conversations. Eventually we met, we spent a weekend together, her mom and her dad, and, they brought photo albums, and we sort of talked and laughed. And it was then that I realized, in a lot of ways, just how similar our upbringings really were. We both grew up in these small Midwestern towns, and, I was looking at these photos, and it was obviously of a different family, but you could really easily substitute my family in, with the fishing rods and the, campouts and things like that. So it was a lot of relationship building, and it was a lot of, sitting and just listening and letting people decide what stories they wanted to tell, and then when it was okay to ask more. But, it's the worst part of my job is knowing that I'm going to cause people pain by asking them to relive trauma and tragedy. And I definitely don't relish that. I think it's a real strength of the character of the people involved in the story, and just their love for Lolly and Julie, that they were willing to go through that all over again to make sure that their legacy was preserved. And I felt really honored to be able to be the one to do that.
Yeah, I think it's a testament to you and to the writing that they just come so alive in the pages of this book. It's almost like if you had told me that you actually knew them, it would be hard not to believe that, because you just get so close to them. There are so many people that you worked with, investigators and others. We could probably spend a whole night on that, but and there may be somebody else you want to bring up, but two names that stuck out to me that I was hoping you could tell us about briefly, and how they helped you on your journey, were Tim Alley. If I have this right, he was the original lead law enforcement ranger on the case, and then an attorney named Deirdre Enright, who was Darrell Rice's attorney. Can you talk about them and their role in your investigation?
Mm-hmm. So crimes that happen in our national parks are the joint purview of the FBI and the National Park Service law enforcement rangers. We have two types of rangers in this country. We have interpretive rangers who do a lot of the programming, and then we have the law enforcement rangers who, are gun carrying, badge carrying cops, basically, who are trained to deal with backcountry crime. And so you have this very urban kind of multifaceted organization in the FBI, and then this very sort of wilderness focused organization in the National Park Service Rangers. And to any extent, no matter who the humans are involved, there's a culture clash there. Their training is very different. Their mission is very different. And in 1996, this was one of the first, not the first, but one of the first joint cases. It was also one of the very first cases in which the FBI was using their brand new evidence response teams, which had come out of the 1992 Oklahoma City bombing. So a lot of kind of firsts and newness happening there. When I had originally visited the crime scene, I did so with some of the active and past FBI agents who had worked it, and some of the active and past NPS law enforcement rangers who had worked it. Tim Alley had been one of the lead investigators for the National Park Service. And he's just, he's a great guy. And he's, I kind of joke in the book that he's sort of right out of central casting. If you wanted to picture what a law enforcement ranger would look like, you can't do any better than picturing Tim Alley. And having talked to him that day, it was immediately obvious to me, first of all, how hard he had worked, and secondly, how invested he was, not just in Lolly and Julie, but also in especially the Williams family. By then, the Winans family, her mom had died, her father was in late stages Alzheimer's, but certainly, I could see the way in which the story continued to haunt him, and the way in which this case, even though he was retired, was still so kind of front and center for him. So he was a great source for me initially when I was looking for information on the case. When I finally got some of the court documents and I started to realize just how thin the case was against Rice, and how there was next to no evidence, I started having more questions about what the federal government had decided. And it took me quite a while to approach Deirdre Enright, who had been one of Rice's defense attorneys and had gone on to found the Virginia Innocence Project. And I think I worried for a while that she was knowingly harboring a murderer. And so I was a little, and some people had warned me, you know, watch out. But I eventually did contact her, and lo and behold, she was really willing to work with me. And not only that, but during the court proceedings, she had sort of ferreted out that what was supposed to be all of the evidence that the defense team was getting was a tiny fraction that they were getting from the prosecution. And she figured out through some kind of like noir sleuthing that there was this entire storage unit, the kind that you'd put like a boat or your house furniture in, filled with evidence that hadn't been getting back to the defense. And so she bought a photocopier and brought 20 feet worth of an extension cord and plugged it into the one outlet she could find. And she made copies of over 20 boxes of evidence that had not really seen the light of day. And so once I introduced myself and we got to know each other a little bit, she agreed to grant me access to those 22 boxes, you know, probably over about 5,000 pages in all. And then eventually, I think the nature of this is just so compelling to people that she eventually agreed to kind of reinvestigate the case from the start with me. And in that point, we kind of had a partnership where we were literally going through all of this evidence all over again.
Now, there's so much to go over, but you along the way in the book and also in general, there's an alternative suspect that's identified. And as much as you'd like to describe, can you talk about that person and why? And I honestly, I think you do such a brilliant job of convincing people that you have found the real killer. But can you talk a little bit about how that suspect emerged? Perhaps why he was never considered for this, for Lolly and Julie's crime, and then kind of what happened with him.
Yeah, and I think it's the nature of these investigations to go down rabbit holes. So at various points in my investigation, I had all sorts of suspects, some of which had been the FBI suspects at one time or another, including some of the park rangers who worked the case. The FBI was really sure for a while that one of them might have done it. But eventually I do settle on this man named Mark Ivanitz, who, again, I can't say for sure whether or not he did it, but I certainly can say he needs a much better look than he's ever gotten. And we know that he was the perpetrator in several violent crimes against young women and teenage girls. And they have some of those cases have really profound similarities to Lolly and Julie's case. Another thing that we know is that Lolly and Julie's murder were 2 of 8 that occurred in a very small radius in rural Virginia over the course of about 16 months. And that led multiple behavioral profilers, including FBI profilers, to sort of offer a sort of a theory, a fairly good theory, I think, that this was a serial killer at work. Ivanitz certainly fits that MO. And so one of the things I do in the book is, again, I try to lay out as objectively as I can the case against Rice. I try to lay out objectively as I can the case against Ivanitz. There are a few other people in the book who I also think are suspects, and I try to give some breadcrumbs for folks there too. Because what I really want readers to have the opportunity to do is what has not yet occurred, which is for people to take sort of an objective look at all of these characters and come to the conclusion of who best seems to fit the MO of this particular crime.
One of the most powerful parts of the book is when, and you write about how you were essentially bracing yourself for this, is when you finally sat down and reviewed crime scene photos that, you know, you've been working on this for so long, and this was your first opportunity to look at what actually had been done to these women. And you also talk about, you knew this project might take a toll on you based on other writers' projects. Can you talk about that experience of seeing those photos, and also in general, you know, what it was like carrying around such a burdensome project?
Yeah, you know, I think of myself primarily as a science writer. You know, I'm not a crime reporter. I don't work crime beat, you know, and while I certainly listen to some true crime podcasts and things like that, I have no appetite for that sort of thing, especially for violence of any sort. And so I went in knowing, you know, that this was going to leave a mark, and being well aware of the plights of people like David Carr and Michelle McNamara, who, you know, ultimately lost their lives doing this kind of reporting. And I really wrestled with the idea of, like, what would I do if the autopsy photos or the crime scene photos presented themselves to me. And for a long time, I thought, I'm just not going to look at them. But then I thought, you know, what right do I have to not look at them? Like, what right do I not have? I have the opportunity and I have the resources to examine this case and to examine what I really strongly believe is multiple missteps taken by the federal government that have led this to remain an open case. So who am I to just sort of become this dilettante and say, well, you know, I'll look at these log books, but I won't look at that. And so eventually I did decide to look at everything that was offered to me, but it was, you know, it's as gruesome as you would imagine it is, you know. And I think there's a real reason that when we watch true crime TV shows or listen to podcasts, you know, all of that gets really sanitized and whitewashed because it is just so arresting and affecting. But it's also what Tim Alley and Deirdre Enright and their FBI counterparts do every single day with their jobs.
We're drawing close to the end. I wanted to turn to just a couple of writerly approaches. Can you talk, first of all, about the pandemic? Were you writing and researching and finishing during the pandemic, and how the heck did that affect things?
Yeah, I was, and we continue to investigate the case. You know, Deirdre and I are still working very actively on the case, and we're also now looking at a few additional murders that we believe were also perpetrated by Mark Ivanitz. So the work is ongoing, but eventually the book had to get out. So yeah, you know, the pandemic, I was very cautious. I did continue to do a little traveling down to Virginia. I had been traveling regularly to meet with the Innocence Project team down there that was working on this case. When everything went remote, we had a very patient assistant who was making PDF files of thousands of pages of documents so that we could take a look at them. So, you know, the work is ongoing, but certainly, you know, I think what's, you know, journalism at its best is spending a day with someone, you know, and as you've probably found out, like if you spend a day with someone, it's in that last hour when you're getting out of their pickup truck that they say the thing you need them to say. And it's really hard to replicate that on a phone call or a Zoom call.
Now, can you talk just briefly about your road to publication? And just for people who are writers and interested in that kind of thing. And also, can you offer any advice to writers who might be thinking about tackling a project of this type, whether it's true crime or just in-depth science-based reporting?
Yeah, I have a really great literary agent. So when I think something's a book, the first big stoplight that I have to get through is whether or not she agrees. In this particular case, I had, as I said, I had just finished a series of articles for the Boston Globe on this woman who had went missing on the Appalachian Trail. And I think that had sort of identified me as a writer who does this kind of work. So when we decided that there was enough, there was 90,000 words worth of things to say with this story, she was the one who then pitched the book to editors. And I was lucky enough to have multiple editors who were interested, and went with Algonquin because my editor there so clearly got how this was not sort of, you know, consumer-based true crime, right? This wasn't voyeurism. It wasn't sensationalism. She got the bigger stories about access to wilderness, about, you know, problems with forensic evidence. And I felt like Lolly and Julie's story was really safe with her. And she was the one who really pushed me to include part of my own narrative into the book. I had done a fantastic job of keeping myself out of the book and hiding behind all of the journalistic bells and whistles that we use to act like we're not a part of this story. And, you know, she knew that was disingenuous, and she knew how deeply the story had impacted me. And so she sent me back after the rough draft and was like, yeah, but now you need to tell the actual story, and you need to tell what actually was happening behind the scenes. And I really resisted that for a long time. This isn't supposed to be a memoir. It's supposed to be a story about Lolly and Julie, but she was absolutely right that I couldn't tell the story unless I identified myself as the narrator telling it and what my process was. And I'm so glad she pushed me. It was really uncomfortable, but I think it's a much better book because of it.
Yeah, it's just so effective hearing from you about them and what you did. there's so much more I want to talk to you about, but is there anything I've left out? Is there anything you'd like to tell people about Lolly and Julie, the book, the research? What have I left out on my end?
You haven't left out anything except you didn't take my bait to talk about your own books.
No.
I just think it's so fantastic that you do journalism and fiction. And I think it's remarkable that you can wear both of those hats.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's something I like to do, and I really enjoy it.
Do you feel like they inform each other, or do they live in separate buckets for you?
I do think they inform each other, both from I do steal from my own headlines sometimes in terms of putting a fictional hat on something I've written about in my day job. But I think also just the discipline of being a journalist, the ability to do research, kind of elemental things, but I think they really actually have helped me a lot as a fiction writer. Partly just because, there's no such thing as writer's block when you write professionally. You just have to get it done. And that's been a really important lesson for me, both in my day job and also, getting that manuscript in on time.
I think as nonfiction writers, one of the challenges we sometimes have is we have this just massive documents and sources and information, and how do we find the through line and the narrative arc in it? And it seems to me like your fiction skills probably help you out a lot with that.
Yeah, I think so. You talked a little bit about the further investigation you're doing on this case, but what else are you working on? Do you have another book in the works that you can talk about?
Sure. I've got a couple of, I got really passionate about this idea of wrongful conviction and exonerations, that this movement that's happening, something like 3,000 people in the last, I think 5 to 10 years have been exonerated for crimes they didn't commit. And so that was just such an eye-opening experience for me that I have a few magazine articles I'm working on for that. And then I'm dipping my toe into a new project that's also kind of a combined investigation and memoir, looking at one of my ancestors who was one of the very first women in America killed for being a witch.
Oh, gosh.
So more crime, but much older, and I think more digestible crime late at night than this one.
Yeah, no, that sounds remarkable. Getting back real briefly to the topic of the outdoors and women and your own experiences now, have things changed? I mean, you mentioned that 91% statistic is pretty recent, but have things changed in the past 25 years?
Things are starting to change. Some really great journalists and some really brave whistleblowers within the National Park Service have caused kind of a reckoning that's looked at things like, for instance, even sexual harassment and sexual assault among employees in parks. Outside Magazine did a really powerful expose looking at the Colorado River and the Grand Canyon. And so I think that kind of reporting and more whistleblowers coming forward has sort of forced that conversation. Woods Women sadly no longer exist, but there are some new really wonderful organizations that are really looking at making sure that everybody, regardless of race, color, ethnicity, sexual, gender orientation, even just body shape, have more access to the wilderness. So I think it's a really positive start and it's really positive momentum, but there's still a lot of work to be done.
And are you, with your schedule, are you able to get out and do some hiking and some wilderness exploring?
Not a lot of hiking these days, but I do trail run almost every day. I have two rescue mutts from the South who love to be on trail, and we're out just about every single day together. And that's been really important to me too, to make sure that I don't lose the wilderness doing all of this reporting, which at times it just felt tempting to just step away from it. But I love it and it remains my salvation, and I don't want it taken away from me. So we definitely get outside.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you again so much. Great to hear about this book. I hope everyone on the webinar tonight will seek it out if you don't have it already. I really, really commend it, and thank you so much for writing it. And I'm going to turn it back to Linda.
Wow. This is an extraordinary conversation, an extraordinary story, extraordinary interviewer. And I am just so happy that we have a recording of this, because this is very important. just Trailed reveals really those long shadows cast by violence against women and in the backcountry, and so much came out of this story, an important one, and we really thank you for telling it, Kate. And Andrew, boy, you've been a superb conversant tonight. We could spend another few hours. Wow. Your journalism, you've just got a real amazing skill. So thanks so much to both of you for this fascinating discussion. We've added a link in the chat box where any of you in the audience can purchase a copy of Trailed if you haven't already. We will be hand selling this from here on. And, just thank you for being with us and sharing your story and your time. Thanks to everyone in our audience for joining us, and just, remind everyone to purchase Kate's book, purchase Andrew's upcoming books and past books. And, Gramercy Books, we're open 7 days a week, 10 to 6. And, we're just so grateful for you spending time, part of your evening with us, and hope you join us again soon. Kate, come to Columbus next time in person. We would really
I promise.
love that. Okay.
Absolutely.
It's a deal. Okay. Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, have a wonderful night. What's left of it. And thanks for being with us.